Good morning, friends, staff, students, and colleagues. It's nice to see you here again. I met some of you at the launch of this series. My name is Mady-Ann Andrade. I'm the Vice Dean, Faculty Affairs and Equity, and a professor in biology here at UTSC. I bring you welcome and greetings from the Office of the Vice Principal and Dean. The Dean really is very invested and enjoys this series, but he is in Turkey at the moment, so I am doing the introduction. This spring speaker series, Great Exploration, will come to a conclusion with today's talk, but we're happy to confirm that we do have dates for the fall. There's some flyers out in the foyer, and we do hope to see you then. Great, I'm glad you enjoyed it. So those dates are in October, and the topics and the speakers will be confirmed over the coming months. Today we have the privilege of a talk and discussion led by Professor Chris Cochrane. Professor Cochrane is an associate professor of political science here at UTSC, associate chair of that department, and also a member of the School of Public Policy and Governance at U of T. He joined the faculty of University of Toronto Scarborough in 2010 after completing a master's at McGill and a PhD here at U of T. His main scholarly focus is on ideology and political disagreement in Canada and other democratic countries. He's the author of the book Left and Right, The Small World of Political Ideas. And this book, published in 2015, together with a number of his papers, all published in influential journals in the discipline, make clear the hallmarks of his work, which are the search for understanding the ideological fractures in the political system. He's no stranger to controversy. And how these are related to the society in which they're formed. And exciting for me to see the overlaps with my interests in biology, the use of data mining and computational techniques to make accessible the rich documentation in parliamentary and other government processes. So we've got the written word, and then ways of extracting data from the written word to support and make new arguments about the causation and the patterns at a broad level of these ideological divisions. Professor Cochrane is the lead investigator of the Hansard 150 project. So the Hansard then is the complete written record of parliamentary debates over the last 150 years. And with funding he received from the U of T Canada's Sesquicentennial Fund, he will be using digital tools to extract data from that record. So we should soon hear some new things about the history of Canada as represented in that record. He's also the lead, and has been since its inception, of the Linked Parliamentary Data Project, which uses a similar approach, but in a comparative way, to look at what parliamentary speeches in Canada, the UK, and the Netherlands have to tell us about the ideology and political process. And for that, he's now just received his second grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Very challenging grants to get. Professor Cochrane is also a gifted teacher. He was honored in 2013 as Professor of the Year by the UTSC Underground, the student-led paper, an award for outstanding excellence in teaching and dedication to imparting knowledge. He was a 2016 recipient of the UTSC Faculty Teaching Award, and he's also, in addition to his research, made his stamp on political understanding in Canada by being co-author and then the primary author of Canadian Politics Critical Approaches, a textbook that's very widely used in Canada that talks both about the context and the ideological impacts of political discourse. So it's this ability of his to capture, explain, and contextualize polarizing political debates that has also led to his regular appearance in the media. You may, especially during the American election and during our own election, have seen his face and heard his voice frequently. In fact, Dean Goff tells me that whenever someone from UTSC, a faculty member, has an appearance in the media, he reads the story, he reads the background, and then he contacts them. But in the case of Chris, he had to stop doing that because he felt like he was pestering him almost on a daily basis. So his ability to do these things and to talk about it to a wide audience is the subject of today's lecture as well. The growing left-right political divide in Canada and the US is his topic, and please join me in welcoming Professor Chris Cochrane.
Thanks, Mady-Ann, for a very nice introduction. I guess I'd say two things at the outset. One of the projects, I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but one of the projects that I'm involved in, as Mady-Ann mentioned, is looking at trying to find ways to teach computers to read Hansard. And we calculated, given the number of words and the average rate of reading, that if you read Hansard at a rate of a novel's worth of reading each day, you could get through the English part in 67 years. That was about the estimate. So it's something obviously that's much better suited to computers if we can find a way to teach them how to read and extract meaningful content from it. And in terms of media appearances and other things, I think there's a tendency among political scientists and others who are really interested in politics to wish that a lot of other people were excited about politics and constantly engaged in politics. And I think it's important, given that it's necessary, but I always do wish that to some degree we could live in a society where it was a little bit less necessary than it is today. And you see a lot of political awareness now, and I think a lot of it comes from a position of sort of anxiety rather than the comfortable 90s, or at least the more comfortable 90s. So what I want to try to do a little bit today is talk about one of the main lines of political disagreement, which is the left-right political divide, and I'll do my best to explain what that is, and with the acknowledgement that it's more difficult than it looks like. I'll talk about some of the evidence about where it comes from, what might be some of the factors that are behind the left-right political divide. And I'll look at the pattern in the United States, especially. I think that's the one most of us are probably most familiar with, given the last election, the fiasco, you could say, of the last election. But I'll also talk about it in Canada as well. And so just to say, the main finding here will be, as you'll see, that there's no question that the left-right divide is increasing. The intensity of the divide is increasing in Canada. It's increasing in the United States as well. But there's also a lot of evidence that it's increasing in many other countries too. So when we look for explanations for it, it almost certainly can't be something peculiar to the United States and peculiar to Canada, given how widely it seems to be applying. So let me start with a basic question that I find there's two types of people struggle to answer. So what is the left-right divide? When we go out into a survey setting, or if you're asking people, just regular folks who are responding to a survey, what do you mean, by left-right? When we think of left-right politics, what do you think we mean by that, or what do you mean by that? A couple of things stand out. So the first is a lot of people often get the categories sort of mixed up. They reverse them, right? So they might put, for example, we would normally think of the NDP in Canada, the Democratic Party being on the left, the Conservatives being on the right. A lot of people just reverse them. A few people have never heard of the terms, but a very small number of people. And most people can actually classify the parties in left-right space. Now, what's interesting about that is even the people who reverse the parties tend to get the order of the parties in the right direction, right? So if they think, for example, that the NDP is the most right-wing party, they know the Liberals are in the middle, and they think the Conservatives are the most left-wing party. So I think sometimes there's a lack of understanding about the vocabulary, but an understanding of the concept of what we're actually talking about when we try to position political parties and people in left-right terms. So sometimes people who don't pay attention to politics regularly struggle to define or think about left-right. The other group of people that struggle to define left-right are people who look at it really closely. Left-right, the more you look at it, the less you seem to actually understand what it is. So most people who are involved in politics, politicians, political activists, people who study politics would be able to give you an answer for left-right. But when people actually really start to look at the left-right divide, they find that they can't define it in as clear a way as they might have imagined. So the more you study it, the less easy it becomes to actually say what it is. And this presents a bit of a challenge for me because I've been studying it for a while. And I have to admit, I can't actually tell you what the left-right divide is. I can't give you a concrete definition for it. But I do know it when I see it, and I can show it to you. Right? So I can show you what it looks like, but I can't define it. And this idea, actually, that of knowing something when you see it, and of being able to even to show it in an image, but not being able to say precisely what it is not uncommon, and it's not confined to left-right politics by any stretch. In fact, one of the sort of canonical examples of this phenomena is a United States court case about the definition of hardcore pornography. So the question is, how do you distinguish hardcore pornography from art? And a judge was asked to make a ruling about whether or not a particular image was hardcore pornography rather than art. And the effort there for the judges, the challenge, was to try to find a way to define what you actually mean by hardcore pornography in such a way that is distinguished from other forms of artistic expression. And the judge, Potter Stewart, in this case, famously said, I can't tell you what it is, hardcore pornography, but I know it when I see it, and this is not that. Right? So this phenomena is, and there's many other examples of this, but this phenomena is quite common and quite widespread. Psychologists have looked at it, philosophers have looked at it, and it stems, I argue, from this notion of a family resemblance, that sometimes when you have a category or a word that's designed to describe something from a particular category, you can say that this category is defined by some characteristic that all things within that category share, right? So, I mean, to give you a sort of a bit of a bizarre example, but you might have, a collection of objects, and you might create a category for red objects, and all of the things in the category red objects are red, and so you can define the category in terms of that one property that all of the objects within the category have. The problem is, in ordinary language, and when we talk about things, we come up with words like left, right to describe patterns of political disagreement. The problem is that things now cease to have one thing necessarily that separates them into different categories, and they might act more like a family resemblance. And this is an idea from a very influential philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the idea here is that now all of a sudden, each thing you are trying to categorize has multiple characteristics, and categories of similarity can be defined by these overlapping and crisscrossing connections between all of the different characteristics. So for example, if you think of a family resemblance, what are the properties of a family resemblance? Well, first of all, not everybody in a family resemblance needs to share the same nose, for example. You might recognize a family resemblance and you see that a number of the people in the family resemblance do share a similar kind of nose, but maybe others share the same eyes or the same forehead or some other feature of their face. Maybe it's the hair color, maybe it's the teeth, but it's no one characteristic, because if you were to say this family resemblance is defined by similarity in terms of nose structure, well, then you move across all of the people in the family and you find that not all of them have that particular nose structure. And if you were to say it was eye color, you go across the family and you find they don't all have the same eye color either, or whatever. So characteristic after characteristic, you move through and you find that no one characteristic defines the resemblance. It's these sort of overlapping, crisscrossing connections between the totality of characteristics that defines the resemblance. This is the Kennedy family, for those of you who may not be aware of that. And this is, in my view, an example of this phenomenon. So left-right operates like a family resemblance. There's no one thing that puts all political parties on the left, no one thing that puts all of the political parties on the right. It's these overlapping, crisscrossing connections between parties and people that defines their clustering, in my view. Now, one of the ways that we actually can look at this, and this is a very impressive project, it's a comparative manifesto research project, and it was an effort to try to quantify the meaning of every single political party election platform in every democratic country since the Second World War. So they collected all of the, as much evidence as they could get about what kinds of messages parties were promoting in election platforms, and then, I was going to say forced, but paid people to sit down and read through, sentence by sentence, and classify each sentence into one of 57 different policy categories. So you would read a sentence, and you would say, this sentence supports the free market, for example. So, we'll add one sentence is support for the free market, and maybe one other sentence is opposition to the free market. And there's attitudes about multiculturalism and so on and so forth. And here's an example of just a few of the different coding categories they had. So, anti-imperialism was a category, support for the military. So if the sentence supported the military, you would say this is a support the military sentence. Opposition to the military, pacifism, constitutionalism, democracy, and so on. There's all kinds of different categories, and these are the descriptions that they use. And each political party's election platform in each election is then scored on each of these items as the percentage of sentences in the platform devoted to each of these issues. So if 10% of your platform was devoted to support for the free market, you would get a score of 10 on support for the free market. So this is the manifesto project, and really quite an impressive project. So again, I think there's 21 Western democratic countries that they've coded the data for, all the way back till at least 1945, and in some cases even earlier. So one of the questions I was interested in, thinking of it in left-right terms, is, what happens if we just take all of these political parties, right? We don't worry about what country they're from, we don't worry about what period of history they're from, and we classify them in terms of the extent to which they share certain kinds of policy positions, and it doesn't matter what those policy positions are. So the more similar political parties are to each other across these 57 different policy categories, the more closely they sort of come together, you could imagine, right, in terms of their similarity. And the less similar they are in terms of these 57 categories, the more they push apart. So that was the first part. We're interested in see what would happen if we did that. The second aspect of it that we were interested in is to think of it not just in terms of characteristics that parties share themselves, but also to think of it in terms of which political parties are these parties both similar to. So you could imagine this being like we actually do use the data from a lot of social network analysis, or we use the tools of social network analysis. So you could imagine that now you're not just measuring two people in terms of whether they're directly similar to each other, but you're asking, are these two people directly similar to the same group of other people, which really is, when you think about how a family resemblance can operate. So it's like friends. If you may know somebody and have a direct personal connection to them, and that makes you quite close. Alternatively, you may not have met somebody, but you may both be friends with the same other group of friends, in some cases enemies with the same other group of enemies, or opponents with the same group of opponents, and that also is a connection. So it really was just to throw the data as we had it into a method that would allow us to account for indirect similarities, really. And this is the sort of the visual, the graphic that emerges from it. And I'll describe the coloring, I guess, in some detail. I hope you can see it okay. But the coloring is designed to capture different kinds of party families, and these aren't how we coded them. These were, green, for example, captures green parties, so environmentalist parties and others. The teal points capture socialist parties. So these are parties that are committed to sort of different forms of economic arrangement and socialists. The purple/pink are social democratic parties. Yellow are Christian democratic parties. The blue are conservative parties. Black are far-right national parties. Red are liberal parties. You sort of can't really see them that well clustered. They're there in the middle. They're there. And there's also regionalist parties as well. And one of the interesting things about this sort of this method is that what we actually found was, just throwing it all together, we actually found that green parties, which really don't emerge until the 1990s or later, end up alongside socialist parties. They end up nearer to social democratic parties. Further away, liberal parties are a bit hard to see here, but they're all here, along with Christian democratic parties, and conservative parties are off here. So just throwing all of the data together and looking at it in analysis, we do get something that we might consider to be a left-right divide in politics. Parties that were decades apart historically end up clustering together in this analysis. They're more close to each other if they're on the left, and parties that are in some cases decades apart, countries apart, end up clustering more closely together if they're on the right. And in fact, when we look at the different issues that define the positions of the parties on these, in that network graph, what we actually find is that the parties which are on the left side are delineated by things like social justice, right? So this was a very strong factor common to parties that ended up clustering on the left. And social justice here is a commitment to equality, equal treatment of people, equal treatment of economic classes, greater redistribution of wealth, and so on. You see support for the welfare state. You see environmentalism. You see internationalism, pacifism, support for a more sort of a controlled economy. You see support for labor groups. You see opposition to militarism, and so on. So these are all things that we would normally associate with people and political actors on the left. When we think of the right, we see really, and crucially, support for free enterprise as being a defining characteristic of parties on the right. We see economic orthodoxy, which is defined as supporting the banking industry and support for growth and so on. We see support for the military, support for greater economic incentives, so the idea if you incentivize people economically, they'll work hard. Traditional morality, opposition to the welfare state, support for patriotism. Law and order is a bit peripheral, though I'm going to talk about this in a second. And again, these are all things that I think intuitively we would associate with political parties and actors on the right. So there is some it seems to me, face validity for the argument that what we are capturing when we look at these patterns of agreement and disagreement between political parties is the substantive content that we all describe when we use the term left and right. So even though not all right-wing parties are supportive of free enterprise, not all left-wing parties are supportive of social justice, a lot of them are. It's a very important characteristic in the family resemblances that define these two categories. So that's the broad historical picture. When we break it down by decade, things actually look, in my view, even more interesting. So if you look, for example, at what were the kinds of issues that distinguished the left from the right in the 1960s, and in this graph, the colors we don't really need to get into too much, but in this graph, the position of the points, lower points indicate more left-wing positions, or positions that were more common among left-wing parties, and I'll read them out if the visual is not big enough. On the upper parts of the graphic indicate sort of positions that are more common among right-wing parties, and the size of the bubbles is the frequency with which they appeared in political party election platforms. So larger bubbles appeared more commonly in political party election platforms, smaller bubbles appeared less commonly, less frequently in political party election platforms. So what this says at the most left issues are anti-militarism and support for peace. This is the 1960s, right? They're not discussed a lot by political parties. Pacifism and anti-militarism weren't commonly mentioned in political party manifestos, but when they were almost always mentioned by left-wing parties and never by right-wing parties, right? That's why they end up at the bottom. Social justice, so support for equality, democracy, and labor are left-wing issues that are discussed quite a bit by left-wing parties in the 60s. Support for the welfare state was a big issue for left-wing parties in the 60s. Alternatively, for parties on the right, economic orthodoxy, free market. No one really opposes the welfare state. It's not a popular thing to run on, but whenever that happened, it ended up being a right-wing party. You can see traditional morality and militarism are also items, but really not that big. If you were to define that are right, the sort of kind of right issues would be support for greater productivity, infrastructure, and incentives, right? So this is what the 60s look like according to these data. As we move into the 70s, we can see a couple of changes that are worth mentioning. I want to draw your attention to one. That is that social justice now becomes a very strong anchor for the left, and not only is it very much a left-wing issue in that parties that talk about it are almost always on the left, but it's also something that now starts to define a greater number of the manifestos of political parties, more frequently talked about. For the right, we can see a little bit more coherence. Free market, economic orthodoxy, support for those things are really strong on the right. Efficiency, traditional morality also start to become a bit stronger, as does support for the military. So this is what the 70s look like. Now, notice the environment. People start talking about the environment in the 70s. It starts to appear in political party platforms. But it's not something that the left talked about more than the right or vice versa. It was something that was equally likely to be discussed by right-wing parties as by left-wing parties in the 70s. In the 80s, things change a little bit. We can see a greater clustering here on the right. We see law and order re-emerging, so I'll flag that. You can also see that environmentalism is now, support for the environment is becoming a bigger item, and also something more common among left parties than right parties, so it's moving down a bit in the graph. Support for democracy, social justice, and pacifism are also important. Here's the 90s. The environment is now the signature thing, the signature policy item in left-wing political party election platforms, alongside social justice, greater clustering here on the right, but really the profound emergence of environmentalism as a signature left-wing item, I think, is of some interest. And here's what we see in the 2000s. Environment and social justice are now pretty much defining features of the left-wing family resemblance. Welfare states also sort of left, but right-wing parties also sometimes talk about that. And you can see here the role of law and order, the reemergence of law and order as a right-wing item. That had subsided quite considerably in the post-war era. We also see, again, support for the free market, economic orthodoxy, and efficiency as being characteristics defining the right. So this is sort of the evolution, I guess, of the ideological landscape of left and right. This is the positioning of all of the political parties on a left-right scale. If you take out all of the sort of items and you create a scale of parties that have more of the most left-wing items end up being more left-wing, and parties that have more of the most right-wing items end up being more right-wing. You take it out and you plot it in a histogram. This is the distribution that you see when you plot them all. So you can see there are fewer parties that are really far off to the left, fewer parties are really far off to the right. A lot of parties are sort of center-right. A lot of parties are sort of center-left. And again, the coloring here of the bars is different party families, which I think is intuitive for those of us who sort of follow politics regularly. Green parties and socialist parties, which are the green and teal, end up concentrated over here to the left. Conservative parties, populist nationalist parties, and blue and black are concentrated over here to the right. So again, I think there's some face validity there to the measure. One thing I do want to mention and it's a little clearer in black and white, is that there are actually not that many political parties in the center of the political spectrum, the center of the left-right divide. Most political parties are somewhat off to the left or somewhat off to the right. And I should add to that that there are two things about political parties in the center. The first is that there aren't very many political parties in the dead center of the left-right spectrum. And the second thing is that when political parties do go to the center of the left-right spectrum, they tend to fail. They tend not to succeed. So they tend to be small. Now, this is peculiar for those of us who might be most familiar with Canadian politics, because we think of the Liberal Party as the central party, the centre party, and also the dominant party. But Canada is the only country that's like that. And the reason for that probably, as we'll see in a second, have nothing to do with the Liberals' position, or little to do with the Liberal position as a centrist party. So there are some advantages of being in the center, but as we shall see, I think those advantages are often overblown. So this is a bit of a mystery for those of us who study left-right politics and political science in general, because we would have expected the best position of political parties to be the center of the left-right divide. I mean, that was sort of the conventional knowledge. If you appeal to the centrist voter, that's how you win elections. It's great in theory, right? It works perfectly in theory. It just doesn't work at all in practice, and there's really no evidence that this theory works for the real world. Now, the reason it's a bit of a mystery is because when we ask people to position themselves on the left-right scale, when we say, okay, you know, some people talk about politics in left-right terms. Here's a scale that runs from 0 on the left to 10 on the right. Where would you position yourself? Country after country after country, most people, or I should say a plurality of people, identify with the center, the dead center of the political spectrum, and fewer people identify with either extremes. You can see here in Canada, most Canadians say they're in the center, right? Plurality anyway, say they're in the center. Some are center left, some are center right, very few are far left, very few are far right. Country after country, we see the same thing. The United States is a little bit different in that it has a rightward skew, so more Americans identify as the right than the left. But I would say here that the language of left and right is least common in the United States. They use the terms liberal and conservative instead. We obviously can't use them here because they correspond with party labels. So it's possible, in fact likely, that a lot of Americans think of left and right and they say, well, you know, politically I'm right? So they think of right in a literal sense, not a directional sense, and that explains the American distribution. At least many others would mention that. But in virtually every country, the center seems to be the place you want to be, right? So if you're a political party, and the idea is that, you know, political parties that are closest to where most voters are positioned should win the election, then presumably you would want to go to the center of the political spectrum, right? If you were to set up or advise a party. So why don't parties do that? Well, here's my answer to why parties don't do that. This is a bit of a complicated graph. So I'll summarize it in general, but I want to lead you through it as well. So when we survey people country after country in all of the sort of democratic countries after each election, we ask them all kinds of questions like where they position themselves in left-right space, where they think of the political parties, and so on. One of the questions we ask them is, how do you feel about different political parties? Right? On a scale of 0, meaning you really hate them, and 100, meaning you really love them, how do you feel about all of these political parties? And what this graph captures is the average answers of people in all countries to that question, the feeling thermometer question, for those who identify here for the far left, who self-identify and say, I'm on the far left politics. My left-right position is far left. And this is the feeling thermometer, so I've standardized it to 0 means you really hate them, 10 means you really love them. So parties that are placed lower, it means that people on the far left really hate them. Parties that are positioned at higher positions means people on the far left really love them. So that's what the height indicates. And the axis across the horizon, the x-axis, is the left-right position of the parties themselves. So parties that are closer to this side are left parties. Parties that are over here are right parties. So all this graph is showing us is that people who self-identify and say, I'm on the far left, on average, really like political parties that are on the far left and really hate political parties that are on the far right. That, in my view, is not a mystery. I think we would have expected to see that, right? And when we ask people who identify on the far right how they feel, we see just exactly the opposite, right? people who self-identify on the far right, so at 10 on a left-right scale. They hate political parties that are on the far left, and they love political parties that are on the far right. So again, there's nothing, I think, counterintuitive about that finding. It's what we would have expected. And as we fill in and we look at, sort of the moderate left, right, people who are a little bit less left-wing, we see the same pattern. It's just that people who are on the center left, for example, love left-wing parties a little bit less and hate right-wing parties a little bit less, right? That's what seems to define, or at least be typical of people who are on the center left. The same thing, again, for those who identify on the right. People who are on the center right, they like right-wing parties a little bit more, but they don't love them. They dislike left-wing parties a little bit more, but they don't hate them, right? So there's nothing unusual about that. But here's, I think, the interesting thing. When you ask people who identify in the center, what do you find? And it is not the case, or I should say not very much the case, and arguably not at all the case, that people in the center prefer center parties, right? People in the center are indifferent between left parties, center parties, and right parties. So when we think of the distribution, when you hear, for example, that most people are in the center, well, why don't center parties benefit there? And it's because the center is not a position in the same sense as left or right. So in left-right politics, it seems that political parties are drawn to the left and drawn to the right because people on the left and the right do care, and people in the center, for the most part, or I should say on average, do not. Right? So there's no benefit. There's no greater likelihood that folks in the center will vote for parties in the center. And I think that's a bit of an explanation for why, given that everybody thinks they're in the center, political parties that go there don't win, and so few parties actually end up going to the political center outside of Canada. So we'll see. So where does left-right come from? I mean, we see that it's characterized the politics of democratic countries at least since the Second World War, and some trace its roots all the way back to the end of the Napoleonic era in France, even before that actually, to the early days of the French Revolution. But it seems that wherever democratic politics goes, the left-right divide seems to go with it. So we might ask ourselves, where does left-right come from? I can tell you just a couple of things about sort of what researchers have found about the origins of left-right. The first is that the left-right divide is intuitive, right? It's not something that people sort of think about and come up with their own sort of position. They think really hard about evidence and data and all this other stuff, and then they say, oh, you know what, having considered everything, it seems to me that the left is the best position, or the right is the best position. The evidence suggests that's not how people think about politics. There's an intuitive aspect. People, as we'll see, are drawn to sort of left-right politics almost as an initial sort of this side kind of resonates with me the most, and then they get involved and they find all kinds of arguments to support the position that they've already adopted. I'll show you some evidence for this. And then they can argue till they're blue in the face, but the bottom line is put two incredibly intelligent people in a room together who know all the ins and outs of the economy or politics or whatever, have them argue with each other until they're blue in the face. They will leave with the same opinions they went in with, right? And you see this, constantly, right? So it's an interesting thing. You've probably not had the experience of convincing some other highly sophisticated person, oh, you know what, you're right, I am going to abandon the left and go on to the right or whatever, and so on. We'll look at that. The second, this is a bit more controversial. Maybe people who study this stuff, inside out, and this is their main field, can dissuade me from this idea. But given the evidence, I just can't see the argument against the notion that to some degree our left-right politics, there is an innate element to it. So there's something we're born with that seems to make people more drawn to left positions, more drawn to right positions. It's context dependent. I'll show you the evidence for it. Maybe we can think it through. I'll show the evidence in some detail. We don't have to go through the evidence in some detail. There's also quite obviously a social element, right? There's many different social aspects to the left-right divide. People pick it up in some sense by virtue of who they're associating with or what their social context looks like, and I'll show you evidence really for each of these components. So what's the evidence for intuition? A very influential book. It's really the summary of the Nobel Prize-winning research agenda of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, but Tversky died before they got the Nobel, so he didn't get the Nobel, but he was very much implicated in the research agenda. Some of you may have read this book. It was a New York Times bestseller. That book is Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's by Daniel Kahneman, and it's a summary of all of their sort of research over many decades. The basic argument of the book, he uses what's called a sort of dual processing model of cognition. And the basic argument of the book is that there's two elements of cognition. One is a kind of a lazy but very quick intuitive aspect of cognition where we just kind of go through the world, we see something, we witness something, we have an immediate reaction to it even before we've had a chance to think about it, right? And that's an intuitive aspect, an intuitive reaction that we have. And then there's the second part of our brain that we can use, which is a rational part, where we really think something through, we're thinking about something like we're doing a math equation or something like that, right? We're not using our intuition there where we shouldn't be. We're probably specifying it rationally and trying to come up with a really formal way of understanding it. And a great example, actually, of this phenomena, and I love to use this one, this works perfectly. Like, as in perfectly, in a class of 200 people, you might get 4 that it doesn't work on. And it goes something like this. You ask a group of people, imagine that you're planning a wedding and you have to arrange 25 tables, and on each table you have to buy a centerpiece. Each centerpiece costs $17. How much money do you need to buy all the centerpieces, right? There's some grumbling in the room that students get into politics, they don't have to take math, why is he making us do this or whatever. But they kind of write it out on a piece of paper and they come up with an answer, right? So that's a moderately challenging math question. You can answer it in your head, but for most people, they would use pen and paper and come up with an answer to that. They get it. They write it down. And then you ask them a very easy math question, right? You say, all right, you want to buy a bat and a ball. The bat and the ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost, right? People are sort of comfortable. Write it down. They bring it up. Almost everybody says that the ball costs 10 cents, right? So I'll write down 10 cents, but the ball actually costs 5 cents, right? And it's because if the ball costs 10 cents and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, then the bat would cost $1.10, and together they would cost $1.20. But because the ball costs 5 cents, the bat costs $1 more than the ball, the bat's $1.05, and together they cost $1.10. And everybody gets that question wrong, right? I got it wrong too when I was reading through the book, right? It's not my example, it's Kahneman's example. I thought I'm going to trick everybody I know with that question. So why is that, right? How is it that we can answer correctly a quite difficult math question, and yet are incorrect when it comes to a far simpler math question? And Kahneman's answer is that it's because in the first case, we know our intuition can't handle the job. We have no intuition of what 17 times 25 is, right? Or very few of us actually do. So we write it out. We can't use our intuition. But in the second case, we have an immediate intuitive reaction, right? I know what that is, 10 cents. Boom, 10 cents and you hand it in. But the intuition is wrong, right? And the intuition is wrong because the question is actually designed to bias your intuition in a particular way to thinking of tens, $1, 10. Your intuition just spits out 10. You didn't really think about it. It's your sort of, your lazy controller. And the idea is that most of what we do on a day-to-day, the overwhelming majority of what we do is actually this sort of lazy intuition, right? It's a lazy intuition that works. We don't really think things through rationally. We just kind of have a gut feeling, and we go with that. And the moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, another very influential book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, he says, listen, your politics comes from your intuition. Right? It comes from your intuition. Your morals come from your intuition. These are not things that you've thought about like you think about a math equation. These are things that you just feel to be true, and have then gone out into the world and found all kinds of rational arguments in support of. Right? This is his basic argument. He has all kinds of great examples of this. I mean, all kinds of great examples. One is, for example, he asks about incest. That if you ask people about incest, they have an immediate reaction like, oh, God, it's disgusting, right? And then you say, well, why is that? And they give all kinds of rationalizations for why they think incest is wrong. But the rationalizations are just complete rationalizations, right? They're not the reason. They're just the reasons people cite for explaining something they feel to be wrong intuitively, right? Other examples, ask college students, if they're atheists, right? Quite a considerable number will say, yeah, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. Then ask them to sell you their soul for $2, right? Most atheists won't actually sell you their souls, right? Or at least a lot won't for $2, which is, the great question, right? Why don't atheists sell their souls? So there's this kind of intuitive aspect that anchors a lot of our moral aspects. In terms of the innate side of it, the innate side of the evidence, so here's some influential work. It's a mix of political scientists and behavioral geneticists, and they're trying to understand potentially innate elements of human behavior, right? I mean, they try to think of it in these ways. And politics is a little bit far off to be usually conceptualized in terms of innate predispositions. And it isn't the case that all of left-right politics, or even arguably a large chunk or most of left-right politics, can be explained by things that people inherit. I'm mindful of a bit of time, but I'll give you the general setup of their design. And the general setup of the design is this. Let's compare the politics of identical twins who share 100% of the same genetic DNA and non-identical twins who share, on average, 50% of the same genes. And given that both identical twins and non-identical twins are raised by the same parents, in the same house, in the same community, at the same time, are the same age, and so on and so forth, if there is no heritable component, there's no part of political difference that's explained by things that you inherit, things in your genes, then we should expect to see that non-identical twins and identical twins are both equally alike when it comes to politics. Right? They should be, if one's a staunch conservative, then the other should be a staunch conservative to the exact same degree, regardless of whether they're identical twins or non-identical twins. But in fact, in study after study, they find that this simply is not the case, right? And I'll show you their measures, sort of formalization, I guess, of their measures. But they find study after study that identical twins are considerably more likely to be similarly politically. So they're more likely to share the same kinds of politics than are non-identical twins. In fact, non-identical twins are no more likely to be similar to each other than are any other sort of regular sibling, right? But identical twins are very likely to be similar to each other. So if one is a hard conservative, the other one is likely to be a hard conservative. If one is a hard liberal, the other one, or on the left, the other is likely to be quite far on the left. So this finding strongly suggests the presence of some heritable element. In fact, they find that, they say 16% is attributable to shared environment, which means growing up in the same household explains 16% of the variation in ideology as they see it. 32% is attributable to heritability, and 53% here is attributable to unshared environment. So just random stuff. There is still differences between identical twins. The key finding here, though, is that the differences between identical twins are considerably smaller than the differences between non-identical twins. And if it isn't genes, they ask, then what else could possibly explain this? Right? It's an interesting question and quite controversial. What about social aspects? This is another, there's all kinds of different examples of this that you could use. What about social aspects? How does this matter? Well, I don't know if any of you are sports team enthusiasts, right? But it seems to be the case that people attach themselves to a sports team at some early period of their life, often because it's the sports team from their region or the one from where they grew up or whatever. And then they cheer for that sports team no matter what. It doesn't matter who the players are, how the team is doing. Are they going watching it? And in Leafs Nation, right? It's always easier to sort of make this case, right? You can never doubt the loyalty of a Maple Leafs fan. And they watch the game, and the referee makes a call, and one side genuinely sees it one way, like that was clearly a penalty. The other side doesn't see it that way. So there's all kinds of evidence that these sort of social aspects of identification with a group strongly influence people's politics. And here's a graph I really like. There's a bit of a backstory to it. Backstory goes something like this. Nobody really makes money in the political business. I mean, you make some money there, but for the most part, the way market research firms who conduct polling, the way they make money is they run studies for corporations and companies who pay them quite a bit of money to do things like track our brand. How is our brand doing in public opinion? If you're United Airlines, for example, you would sort of watch, right, as your brand dropped out, and you think, okay, we clearly have a problem, I wonder what happened, right? That's something like that. But that's what they're interested in. So that's really where market research firms make their money. But sometimes they'll tack on to the end of the survey that they've done and has been paid for by a corporation. They'll tack on a question about politics that they can then send out to the newspapers, usually for free, but from which they then get some publicity, right? Like according to Ipsos or according to whatever company, this number of people are going to vote for Clinton or whatever, or Trump, and that's how they do this. So this is an example of what happened over a very long period of time with the company Godfather's Pizza, right, which is a pizza company. And they sell pizza, and they send out surveys that say, how's our pizza taste, so they could see if they're doing innovations or something, whether or not people notice. And they ask people, how does it taste? And they redo these surveys time and time again. And then at the end of the survey, the company tacks on, are you a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, right? Just to sort of, there's a couple of other reasons for that, but mainly just to sort of get a lay of the political landscape. And so for a very long period of time, you ask Democrats, Republicans, Independents how they like Godfather's Pizza. They tend to like Godfather's Pizza, so here negative is we hate it, it's disgusting. Positive means we love it, best pizza, whatever. And you sort of go along, and there's no difference between Democrats, Republicans, and Independents in terms of how they rate the taste of Godfather's Pizza. Then Herman Cain announces his candidacy for the Republican nomination for president. And all of a sudden, Republicans start to like the taste of Godfather's Pizza more in the surveys, and Democrats start to like the taste of Godfather's Pizza less in the surveys, right? So Republicans are like, yeah, it's a great pizza, it's better than average, and Democrats are sort of the opposite. Then Herman Cain is embroiled in a sexual harassment complaint at Godfather's Pizza, and now it is the best pizza Republicans have ever had, and sort of disgusting for Democrats, right? So, we think of pizza preferences as having a partisan element in the United States, right, because of its association with one of the political leaders. But here's the thing, and this operates, I should say, like some kind of social identity. There's other kinds of social identity. So party is a social identity. There's other sorts of social identity. But here's the big thing. We think of that as pizza, and you think, who cares? But there's the same evidence for attitudes about same-sex marriage, for attitudes about abortion, for attitudes about racial equality, for attitudes about gender equality, for all kinds of different opinions. The evidence suggests that the parties take a position first, then a lot of their supporters follow. Right? It's not the case that parties are asking and trying to find out what their supporters want. It is the case for most of us some of the time, and for some of us virtually all of the time. All of our positions about politics are heavily influenced, if not outright determined, by the party that we belong to, by the messages that they send. Which is why when you see something like the Republican Party shifting directions on a number of different issues, you can bet that this is going to resonate in public opinion for quite some time, because there are Republicans who are changing their minds about things because their party has gone off in a different direction. And the same happens among Democrats. So that's the social aspect. I'll quickly go through one of the, I think, elephants in the room, frankly, when it comes to explanations, which is when we think of media effects. Initially, when we social scientists went out and started asking people where do they get their information about politics, everyone says the media, right? I mean, at some point, it's either directly the media, I read newspaper, I watch TV, or whatever, or it's indirectly. Well, I talk to so-and-so, and then you go and talk to so-and-so and ask them where they get their information, and they get it from the media somewhere, right? Some kind of media. So the initial assumption was, given that almost all of the political world is only accessible to us through the media, surely then the media must have a massive influence on the way people think about politics, right? Sort of the media must determine how people think about politics. So they went out to study this in different sort of innovative ways and actually found that the media seemed to have virtually no effect at all. When it came to the question of how people, what people feel about particular issues, as far as researchers could tell, there was no effect. So this gave rise to what's called a sort of minimal effects hypothesis. But then as people started to ask the question in a different way, and they started to say, okay, maybe the media doesn't really tell us what to think, but could there be other influential ways that the media might sort of affect people's thinking about politics? And it turns out that there was. One of the very influential ways was this notion of agenda setting, right? Which is the idea that the media isn't really successful at telling us what to think, but it is, to use the term from Cohen, stunningly successful at telling us what to think about. So the kinds of things that we think are important are almost entirely determined by what's circulating in the media. The media starts talking about stuff, we then come to think of those things as being important. Also, how we think about a particular issue. So the kinds of things we think are relevant when we think about a particular issue. You might take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. The kinds of things that you think are most relevant when you think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is also evidence that the media can influence those. So this is known as a framing effect. But even with all of that, we still find a smaller effect for the media than what we might expect otherwise. And when we ask ourselves why that is, why is the media effect not as large as we might have thought, there turns out to be quite an interesting dynamic between sophistication, exposure, and influence. And the argument is this. People who are highly sophisticated politically, people who are engaged in politics regularly, think, eat, sleep, breathe politics, are unlikely to be influenced by some story that they read in the news because they know that that story is just one perspective and they have this sort of broader repertoire of perspectives that they can draw on in their memory, and so this one story doesn't influence them. Right? So highly sophisticated people, unlikely to be influenced by some new piece of political information. People who are very likely to be influenced by new information are people who are not very sophisticated, who don't know much about an issue, who don't think much politically, who aren't able to recognize bias when they see it. They just take it as being the description or the way the world is. So those people are very likely to be influenced by media information. But the thing is that people who are very likely to be influenced by information, who are unsophisticated, don't really follow politics regularly, are unlikely to actually be exposed to political information historically because they don't read the politics section of the newspapers or sit at home and watch the National. They read sports or the funny pages or whatever else. They're not interested in politics. So the people most likely to be influenced are the least likely to be exposed. And the people most likely to be exposed are the least likely to be influenced. So this basic model is used historically to explain why the media doesn't have the massive effect we might have anticipated. But I would argue that we are in desperate need, very quickly, of a new model, because the old days of people having to seek out political news quite actively, right? You had to watch the National. It's unlikely the National was just going to come on and you were going to have to sit there and watch it, right? You had to seek it out or go get a newspaper and read the politics. Those are undermined by things like infotainment, so the creation of movies that have political messages embedded in them that can reach audiences that might not otherwise think of themselves as being highly politicized. Twitter, it's almost impossible to be on Twitter if you're following anybody without being exposed to political messages, and Facebook. So now people who don't or eat, sleep, and breathe politics historically are being exposed to these different kinds of political narratives, and so we might be interested to know what effect that's having on the level of political polarization. My argument and the argument of others, or at least my hunch, and the hunch of others, is that it's having a pretty big impact on why people are more divided. So what's going on in the U.S.? The last election is really unprecedented in modern times in the United States. People have different politics. I would say left, right. There's good arguments that you hear from conservatives, good arguments you hear from folks on the left and others. But the last election is really unprecedented. I have my thoughts on Trump, obviously, but my thoughts on Trump have almost nothing to do with his policy positions. Right? I guess I put it this way: Trump is a different character than Bush. Right? There's similarities, good objections to both, but this is a whole different thing that we're dealing with here. And one of the questions was, what does Trump reflect? Right? Is it a culture war? And sort of an argument that has been going on for a decade in the United States for quite a long time is, what? Elites in the United States are divided, but regular folks aren't. Right? Regular people have never heard of this culture war. And this is the argument that seemed to dominate for decades in the United States. We can ask ourselves, is that true? Is it the case that this is just like eggheads, this is just politicians arguing about politics, but regular people are not actually divided? And the argument is that, it's not true. Right? Nowadays, regular people are intensely divided on political lines. And I'll show you some evidence of that. So first of all, as far as elites go, and this graph is often shown just from here over, but I'll show you the whole thing. This is the extent of ideological polarization. These are measured by Poole and Rosenthal, American political scientists. So this is ideological polarization in the House of Representatives in the United States. So what this is measuring is the extent to which Democratic legislators vote together and the extent to which Republican legislators vote together. And for many years and many decades prior to the 90s, in the United States, the most conservative Democrat legislator was more conservative than the most liberal Republican legislator. So you had overlap between the parties, right? You had people you could go to on both sides to try to reach bipartisan compromise. That no longer exists, right? What this graph shows is that really beginning in the 90s and intensifying, Republicans are now voting together at very high rates. Democrats are voting together at very high rates. And the most liberal Republican is now more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. So the center has hollowed out of American Congress. It no longer exists. You see the same pattern actually in the Senate, right? So it's the same thing. You know, part of this is the Southern Democrats, right? Sort of really coming online and becoming with just regular Democrats, and the old Southern Democrats, it looks like, have left and gone to the Republican Party. Right? So there's clear polarization here. When you look at political party election platforms, you know, you see some slight evidence of heightened polarization, but it's not captured as perfectly as we might have liked. So Republicans move a little bit to the right in the 80s under Reagan, but we don't see the Democrats moving too much to the left. So some polarization, but not that much when it comes to what they're saying in elections. But here's really, I think, the important graph. This is a graph which captures from 1964 until 2012 how Democrats, people who self-identify as Democrats, feel about both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And what you see here is that, you know, on a scale of 0 to 100, Democrats feel about the same as they ever have about their own political party. It's about 80. But they've gone from being sort of indifferent about the Republicans to being outright hostile. Right? So there's an increase in hostility here among Democrats relative to the Republican Party. And this is as much data as we have. There's nothing hidden in the back of this graph. There's no public opinion data that I have access to before this. When we look at Republicans, we see the exact same thing. Right? Republicans as enthusiastic about their own party as they've ever been, but are now much more hostile towards the Democrats. And the data here for Trump weren't available, but I mean, we wouldn't have to take bets to realize that this has now hit rock bottom yet again. Right? So there is a lot of polarization in the United States. It's not just the elites, it's regular people as well, regular rank and file Democrats and Republicans. I don't want to leave Canada out, but I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. What's happening in Canada? Historically, Canada was supposed to be a country where the left-right divide didn't apply. We were often considered, even through the 80s, as being a country that didn't have a left-right politics like every other country. That's no longer true. Since the advent of the Reform Alliance Party in the 90s, and you can see the left-wing move on the NDP in the 90s, there has been a very notable left-right divide in Canadian politics. The Liberals are here in the middle, so higher positions are right, lower positions are left. And this is year of the election in Canada. And these are manifesto data, so party platforms. What you see more recently in Canadian politics in the 2015 election is that there is a cluster of political parties on the center-left. New Democrats, the Liberals, the Green Party, to a lesser degree the Bloc Québécois. So there's this bunch of parties fighting for the same voters on the center-left, and the Conservatives occupy exclusively the right of Canadian politics. So there is a left-right divide in Canada. When you look at different issues, so these are answers to questions about welfare state, gay rights, capital punishment, immigration, abortion, the environment, and these are the best data we have for Canadians over time. You also see evidence of more polarization between the supporters of different parties. So Conservatives move to the right of center on the question of the welfare state, so they want to cut the welfare state or are more likely to want to cut it. The NDP sort of moves left, but you can see a pretty notable left-right divide in 2010 that didn't exist in the 70s. Similar kinds of questions about gay rights. These are different question wordings over time for obvious reasons. Capital punishment, we see a similar pattern. Abortion, again, immigration, the environment, we see the same thing. So parties are differentiating, and so too are the people who support the parties. So we are seeing some sorting and polarization. One graph that I think is telling, and this, again, is not just a Canadian-American thing, this is occurring elsewhere. This is the same graph that I showed you in the United States, but for all the Canadian parties, New Democrats, Liberals, Conservative, Reform Alliance. And what you see here, as in the United States, New Democrat partisans, people who identify as New Democrats, are, they dip in the 90s. It was a disastrous time for the party. They come back up. But New Democrats like their party today about as much as they did in the late 60s. But they certainly don't feel the same way about the Conservatives. Right? So very sort of a lot of hostility here. You can see for Liberals, there's this little bit of a love connection with the New Democrats in the Leighton era, even into the Mulcair era. Liberals are not hostile towards the New Democrats, about as enthusiastic about their own party, though it's been declining for a while, and they dislike the Conservatives more. For Conservatives, again, the 90s were a disaster, right? That was the 93 election where they're reduced to 2 seats. They like the Liberals more than their own party. That's telling something, right, 93. But for the most part, Conservatives feel the same way. They're becoming more hostile towards the other parties. And Reform Alliance, not surprisingly, hate all of the other political parties for the most part, which, we could sort of add this for closer up visual. But anyway. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, first and foremost, the 2016 American election did not come out of the blue. Right? Trump is not an unexpected character. If you were to ask election after election, everything just keeps getting more and more and more polarized. Where does that end? Nobody really knows yet, but Trump certainly is not unexpected, given what you see. The American politics, like the politics of many other countries, has become more divided and more embittered for a very long time. People like each other less and less across political lines now than they did. There have been other times of turmoil as well, but recent decades, this is unprecedented at least, and the pattern in Canada is the same. So thanks for your time.
So, thank you very much for an engaging and chilling talk. I think we're going to move right into the discussion. There are washrooms across the hall. There's food at the back you can help yourself to. But we are going to start right away with the discussion, which I suspect is going to be long and interesting. And so if anyone has questions for Professor Cochrane, if you could just wait till the microphone comes to you, that would be wonderful. Questions?
Hello, my name is Pempenev, and I have one question. In your view, the party divergence in Canada is following somewhat closely, or in the near future, the one we have outlined very clearly in your presentation? And then can you give us some time terms, approximately, though, at this point, what will happen within the next couple of years here in Canada? Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, predictions, I guess one thing I sort of have learned is never make a prediction on camera or in print, right? I guess is the, then the answer is I don't know what will happen, and there's a couple of reasons for that. And I will give you one thing that I think is a bit counterintuitive that people might not be aware of or think of. I actually do think the Liberal Party is in long-term trouble. Despite the fact that Justin Trudeau is a very popular leader, was able to stave off a decades-long period of gradual decline within the Liberal Party in the last election. And people would say, for example, that the Liberals are back. That was sort of the line, right? That this is the return of the historic governing party in Canada. But the result that Trudeau won with in the last election was worse than the result that his father lost with in the 1979 election. So the Liberals have been experiencing a decline for some time. And the challenge for the party, it seems to me, is as politics shifts from a politics of nation building, which the Liberals are very well suited to handle, into a politics of left-right divide. It's difficult for the Liberals to chart an independent course because they have always said historically they are the Canadian party and the party of the center. The problem is, and we see some signs of this already, the problem is, being the party of the center, you might be able to get new Democratic voters if they're scared of the Conservatives, right? That might happen. That happened for the Liberals in the last election. I suspect it's going to happen again in the next provincial election for the provincial Liberals. But the problem is that you start to get sort of encroached on the left. So you already see this. People are saying that the Liberals aren't strong enough in support, for example, of resource development in Alberta. So they're not going to get any Conservatives because there's a Conservative party that says, you know what, forget about a lot of these environmental policies. We're just going to grow the economy. And on the left, you have people who say, well, look, the Liberals are approving pipelines, right? They're not actually preserving the environment. And so people on the left are becoming less enthusiastic. People on the right are never going to be enthusiastic. And so the Liberals run the risk, I think, of being squeezed out as soon as Justin Trudeau's popularity wanes a bit more than it has already. So the Liberals, I think, are going to have to find a way to define themselves either by merging with the NDP de facto or sort of formally. They'll have to find that out. I don't know where the Conservatives are going. Neither do they, actually. Neither does the Conservative Party, right? Because there's very different candidates running in the Conservative leadership race. Michael Chong, for example, has nothing in common with Kelly Leach. It's almost hard to imagine that those two are in the same political party. And the kinds of people supporting those two candidates are not similar kinds of people. They don't have similar kinds of policy positions. So I really don't know where the Conservative Party is going. I would say that I do think that a Trump-like agenda could do better in Canada than most people think. That was the one thing I would say. I don't know that it could win. I actually don't think it could win overall in the national election. I have no doubt that it could win within a a Conservative leadership race, for example. My own view is that Kelly Leitch is not a strong candidate in sort of any of the indicators we would normally use as a strong candidate, but she is actually doing quite well within the party because she is articulating a set of views that are quite widely shared. I don't think it's a silent majority. I don't even think it's silent, but I think it's a reasonable chunk of the Canadian population. So if Michael Chong pulls off an upset victory and wins as leader of the Conservative Party, or the Conservative Party, I should say, of Canada, the future left-right politics in the country will look very different than if somebody like Kelly Leitch wins, or even a Maxime Bernier, frankly. So it's hard to say. It's the short answer. Thanks.
I'm asking whether a change to a PR system, and one that truly would allow for a true representation of people's votes cast. There are a number of systems available, but one that would give you a true representation of the popular vote in the House seats. Would that, and I know it would probably mean going forward a lot of minority governments, continuous, and a lot of coalitions, and they shift and change all over. Fascinated by Borgen TV show. Would that kick the whatevers out of this divide?
Yeah, it would certainly. It would intensify it, I think, in the sense that you would see, as you do in Europe, right? The parties would align in quite clear left-right terms. There's some ambiguity in the center, so I think it would intensify in terms of the party options, right? There are different views on it. Nobody really knows what would happen if we instituted PR. I mean, my guess is, certainly the sky wouldn't fall, right? I think some of the claims for PR are overblown, some of the claims against it are overblown. Some of the claims for our current system are overblown, some of the claims against it. The main claim is that our current system ensures accountability and prevents extremist voices from getting too much recognition. But as you saw in the United States in the last election, there's no real guarantee that an outsider can't infiltrate an insider established party and then benefit from an electoral system designed supposedly to keep people like that out, right, or to keep those sort of fringe views out. But if we were to adopt PR, we would have much greater diversity of views represented in the House of Commons. There's no question. It's not clear how much more diversity of views we would have represented in the cabinet. And that is sort of the interesting question, because one thing I could say for sure, the current party system we have in our single-member plurality system would not just be ported into a PR system. And we wouldn't be able to say, for example, well, that just means the Liberals and the Democrats are going to win permanently, because there would be a change in the party system that would follow the change in the electoral system. There'd be many more political parties. So I guess pros and cons of it. Pros, more diversity of opinion in the House of Commons. Cons, some would argue, more diversity of opinions in the House of Commons. Unclear what effect it would have on cabinet government. You can look, everyone can always point to different cases of government instability. I don't buy those. There's a lot of very stable governments in Europe. But there are certainly cases that, that sort of anyone who studies European government would be able to identify of political parties that stay in power, they stay in cabinet for a very long period of time despite massive fluctuations in their levels of popular support. So the Freedom Party of Austria, far-right nationalist party, widely seen as sort of anti-immigrant, right? I mean, one of their policies was that no foreign-born people should be able to have a job until every single native-born Austrian had a job. So these are the kinds of policies they advocated. They won 27% of the vote in, it was the 2000, or not, maybe it was 1999, but in and around election. They were brought into cabinet, right? It's pretty good. 27% of the popular vote is very good. They're in cabinet. In the next election, people turned against them. Europe threatened to basically ostracize Austria for having a far-right nationalist party in cabinet. They were reduced to 11% of the vote, and they stayed in cabinet, right? So that's the kind of thing that you'd have to worry about. So it wouldn't affect left-right politics, in my view. It would change our political system, I think, in some ways for better, in some ways for worse. And for those interested in the political dynamics of support for PR, I mean, one thing I would say is historically it's been mainly on the left. It's been mainly progressives who've supported PR, and I think that this day that's still true. But there are also a lot of people within the Conservative Party who support PR as well. So there's more consensus, more of a support for that across party lines than the elites that we hear about sort of give credit for. A lot of like social conservatives, for example, argue, look, this Conservative Party is doing nothing for us because it's preoccupied with winning. So let's just chart our own social conservative course. We'll win what we win in terms of share of the popular vote, and then we'll see if they need us or not after the election. So you hear that argument, for instance, on the right. So PR wouldn't affect it, and I really don't know what PR would do to our political system in general. Good question.
You have interestingly shown what has happened, both on the individual voters' side and in politics, among the representatives. How about the why?
Great.
Why did this happen? And if I look back at my own country, where I come from, the Weimar Republic, was that similarly divided at that time? And look what happened afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, so very good. The comparisons with Germany, I'm always, skeptical making parks. I don't know enough about the sort of German historical case, and what I think is just anecdotal. But I do think a couple of things that are worth remembering is that first, the Nazis did come to power through initially democratic means, like at least within the electoral system. But secondly, they actually never received a majority of the popular vote in any election, right? So they managed to get in. I actually think they had something like 34, 35% of the vote at their peak. Then they lost quite considerably and maybe were high 20s or something in the next election, then managed to seize power through internal institutional mechanisms. I think the conditions are quite different, but any time you are at risk of having, and this gets to the electoral system point as well, anytime you are at risk of having 30% or so of the population govern, I think you open yourself up to more unanticipated outcomes than if you require a majority through runoff or through different kinds of electoral systems. The why question, I don't have an answer to, and it's the great question. That is the question there are many different answers out there. Nobody really has a definitive answer. I mean, I think the hunch is that the media has something to do with this, media fragmentation. There was always a view for a long time that a more fragmented media for different reasons would be more likely to produce a polarized public because people increasingly choose their media and they choose entirely different media. It's not now the case that you have to choose between, say, 5 or 6 established sources, right? Now you have a wide variety of choice, and people who are reading Breitbart, for example, on the right are probably not reading, Mother Jones or whatever sort of the equivalents are on the left, right? Some of the main left-wing sources. So now people are in echo chambers to a greater degree, I think, than they have historically. Another media-related explanation is that there's been a hollowing out of local newspaper coverage, which may have had a bit of an ideological bend historically, but the ideological bend wouldn't be consistent. And now what you see is greater and greater concentration of the media in certain centers of the country, aiming at broader messaging, which tends to follow along left-right lines. So that's one line of explanation that people offer. There is some evidence for it. There's some evidence that people who watch political exchange on television, for example, tend to be more hostile towards the other side afterwards. That's one explanation. Another explanation, and this is the one I think is very broad and sort of difficult to pin down, but another line of explanation is that we now live in a time where access to information is unprecedented. I mean, if you think of the access that a grade 6 or 7 student sitting down at a computer has on the internet to information, it rivals what researchers of any kind would have had at their disposal 20 or 25 years ago. So there's a hurricane of information, really, that people are now exposed to. And what we could be seeing is just more of a sort of an ability of people to align the way that they feel with a set of arguments, which may be true or false. Arguments we have for our beliefs don't have to be true. And they have a more sort of coherent ideological mindset emerging just because any argument you want to make, you will be able to go online and find what sounds like a rational argument in support of it, right? So that could be another factor. The only thing I do know, or at least I think I know, based on what we see in the evidence, is that you can't explain this just by looking at the United States, right? You can't say, oh, well, something's happening in American society. We need to figure out Trump and the left-right divide in the U.S. by looking at things just peculiar to the United States. Maybe it's Congress or other explanations people draw on, because it's happening in Canada. It's happening in the United Kingdom. It's happening in France. It's happening in Switzerland. It's happening country after country after country. So my guess is the media. But the evidence for that, the direct systematic evidence, is not as convincing yet as I'd like it to be.
Hi. So I have a question. The last election, federal election, a lot of people, and provincial, there was the remark that a lot of people had thought that the Liberals had outlefted the NDP. And so I'm wondering, moving forward, is this their only way, their only secure way of holding government?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, in the data that I showed earlier, there's a time lag built into the measure of left-right positions to eliminate some of the noisiness over time. So a party's left-right position was defined by the position it took in the current election. 50% of it is the position it took in the current election. A quarter of its left-right position was the position it took in the previous election, and then 12.5% was the position it took in the election previously, and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of stabilizing effect of that data. But just if you take that away, actually the Liberals do emerge as more left-wing than the New Democrats in the last election. And that isn't the first time. Also under Stéphane Dion they emerged, but that was in part because of his green shift. So I guess from a Liberal point of view, yes, I think that is actually the strategy they ought to adopt to win. I think they could beat the NDP. And from the NDP point of view, the move to the center is fine as long as you don't end up being more centrist than the Liberals. And if you think in the last election campaign, for example, what did the NDP campaign on? Balanced budgets, right? That is not a historic NDP platform item. We're going to balance budgets and support small businesses with tax relief, right? I mean, these are not, that's a centrist party's platform. And the Liberals, campaigned on equity, they campaigned on wealth redistribution, they campaigned on environmental protection. And it's the oldest strategy in the Liberal playbook, which is why those of us like me who say, well, things are changing now, this is an entirely different time, the Liberals are in trouble, the NDP is on the rise, so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, the Liberals use exactly the same thing that they used historically, which is, ooh, watch out for the Conservatives. And New Democrats are like, yeah, we got to watch out for the Conservatives, we'll vote for the Liberals. And now the Liberals are the most sort of progressive party anyway. That's right out of the old school Liberal playbook, and it worked again. The question is there a lot of New Democrats now who are thinking to themselves, you know what, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you again. Fool me 3 times, but now, next time, we're not going to get fooled again, right, to use the Bush line. So that, I think, is the risk, right, that you could split the sort of center-left vote again, and then we might see a Conservative, if they can get somebody who can appeal, you might see a Conservative victory or eke out a minority government. They could also be overtaken possibly by the NDP if the NDP gets somebody in there who can appeal. And it's harder to run as a progressive party unless you have a progressive agenda after you've been in power, right? That's always easier to do when you have no track record. Yep.
Can I ask another question? Okay, I have another question. So this is from the Conservative perspective now. So there are a lot of social conservatives and a lot of millennial conservatives who feel like their party is not speaking to them, right? I guess my question is, what is kind of the stubbornness with wanting to move from historical party ideas, from many years past, and kind of modernizing to some of the values that conservatives may still hold for social welfare or social justice? Like, how can the party be competitive in future elections if there isn't a reevaluation, complete reevaluation and somewhat overhaul in some areas of some of their more traditional stances? And is that even possible? And if it's not, then why?
That's a... there's certainly a divide within the Conservative Party. Some argue it's a generational divide between older and younger. And the divide is the sort of traditional conservative small government tax relief policies versus a new kind of, it's highly racialized, obviously, in discourse. There's a lot of discussion of race, identity, and so on and so forth, like pro-Trump, Make America Great Again hats and that kind of thing, that seem to be more prevalent among younger conservatives and sort of a new generation. Which I actually do think is directly a Trump effect or an American effect, Americanization of Canadian conservatism. Whether or not or how they're going to align those two movements, I should say I think the progressive conservatives have left the party, right? The old, the support for guaranteed minimum income, for example, that you saw among some progressive conservatives, the Joe Clark types and others. I think they've already left. And now what you have is a more sort of economically focused libertarian right allied with this new alt-right uncomfortably. I think even religious conservatives are, to some degree, less enamored with the direction of the party than they might have been historically. But I think the challenge is going to be how do they actually reconcile that divide? I don't see the basis of reconciliation beyond their common opposition, right, to the left. But even that, I think it's going to be very challenging. One thing I would say is that when you think of a candidate like Kelly Leitch, for example, who's really sort of appealing to a lot of this, and there are others as well, and this is something that I think I'm mindful of when I watch how the sort of conservative leadership race unfolds, is that a lot of what Kelly Leitch is saying directly is actually uncontroversial, right? Or it seems to me to be quite uncontroversial. So for example, the idea of interviewing immigrants to Canada, about their sort of Canadian values for whatever, that's a policy that really had always been in place for a very long period of time, where anybody immigrating to Canada would have a meeting with an immigration officer, right? So if you were to implement a policy like that behind the scenes, I don't think people would be up in arms about it. I don't think it would appeal to sort of alt-right supporters. But what she's doing intentionally and knowingly is appealing to that theme, as some would call it a dog whistle, but I don't really think it's a dog whistle, to attract the sort of more sort of anti-immigrant or anti-diversity right. And the reason I know she knows that is because I've also looked at her Facebook page, and you see the comments that come after one of her sort of mundane conversations. So surely, she sees those comments as well, or her team sees those comments as well, and could clarify, right? But they don't. So I would even say that Kelly Leitch is now positioned as sort of the alt-right candidate within the Conservative Party. She could be more explicitly alt-right. She's still kind of subtle, like almost polite about it, right? In some settings. But I do think within the Conservative Party there's quite a bit of support for that agenda. I think outside the Conservative Party there could be more support than maybe we think. And I really don't see any future in the Conservative Party for the old progressives.
But how would the party, with the rising cost of living, right? And so you have, I'm just imagining if you were a conservative and you need housing support, or you used to really value the party and its ideals, but now you're finding that, you have less money at the end of the month, or maybe your circumstances have gone and deteriorated so much that now you need social welfare. How is the party going to survive without moving much further than probably it's comfortable with to the left, moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a great example, right, of the difference between the rational element and the intuitive aspect, and the intuitive element of politics. And people have wondered this question for quite some time, like why in the U.S. even, why do so many people vote against their own material self-interest? I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with group identity. There are also sort of conflicting narratives. So what do people like me do, right? Where do I see people like me in the political environment? And you support it like you would a sports team, regardless of policies, regardless of leaders, and so on. I also think there's sort of the conflicting narratives. I mean, to what extent are people pocketbook voters is a question that people have looked at and found surprisingly not that much, right? It seems people surprisingly are not really focused on pocketbook issues. And as far as people abandoning the right, sort of what that would take, I mean, I think the other narrative, if you think, for example, of what Trump was elected on in the last election and what the Conservatives might replicate here with somebody like Bernier on the economic front, the narrative is not you're poor, your job is insecure, we're going to cut your welfare benefits, right? The argument is always, you're poor, your job is insecure, we're going to do things. Well, first of all, that's because of these other people, whether it's elites selling you out to offshore corporations or migrant laborers or illegal, immigrants or whatever else. It's these people. We're going to fix that so that, we'll make America great again, or sort of make Canada great again. So I think people see their economic security in very different ways. The only thing I can really say from the evidence that I've come across in researching it is that the way people see their reality is not, as sort of calculated and as carefully considered as we might look at it from the outside, right? People have an intuitive feeling of where they belong. They have an intuitive feeling or even a desire for the world to work a particular way. And I think they'll run with that, the evidence suggests, against countervailing evidence for a lot further than we might anticipate. I think the Conservatives could come back, but I think, as always, the greater threat and the greater opportunity for the Conservatives isn't what they do, it's what the NDP and the Liberals do. And if New Democrats bail on the Liberals and you end up with the divide, I see the Conservatives being able to split and win minority government, maybe eke out a majority again. Maybe not in the next election, but after that, it's, I think, a good opportunity.
Good morning. I find this quite fascinating. I'm not a political follower, but you have certainly enlightened us all. You mentioned that Canada is the only country that has had a successful central party. Is that likely to continue with all this going on around us? And if so, why Canada?
Yeah, both very good questions. So the first question of why Canada? So why would Canada have this dominant centrist party? It was a mystery to me in my own work. There's a new book coming out. It'll be out, if it's not out already, from Richard Johnson at UBC, which looks at actually what were the Liberals in the Canadian setting? What ideological space did they occupy? And what he finds, he agrees that the center is not an optimal position for political parties for the reasons I've mentioned here. But he says the Liberals are only in the center on average across Canada on the left-right divide. They're not in, and they're also in the center on average in Canada on, say, the nationalism versus Quebec divide. But that's only on average across the country. Within Quebec, the Liberals are the most pro-nationalist, pro-Canada party, and outside Quebec, they are the most pro-Quebec party, right? So they are actually on different sides of that ideological dimension in different parts of the country. So his argument was that the Liberals didn't win because of their ambiguity. They actually won because of the clarity, but they were clear in different ways in different places. So his view is that's what sustained the Liberals as the natural governing party of the country for quite some time. I don't think the left-right divide is advantageous for the Liberals, and unless they could move to, and as they tried to do, actually change the electoral system so that people's preferences were ranked. I think that actually would have been a recipe for Liberal success long into the future. I actually think there's good reasons for moving in the direction of that kind of an electoral system as well. I think it's unfortunate and illegitimate, frankly, for the Liberals to do that because it would benefit them to such a considerable degree. So I guess I could say I agreed with their proposal, disagreed with them doing it the way that they went about doing it, and kind of glad they decided to not proceed. But barring that, I think the Liberals are in real risk of being squeezed out of the middle. And you already see it, right? New Democrats are not satisfied with the Liberals' environmental record because the Liberals are approving pipelines. Conservatives are not satisfied with the Liberals' resource development record because the Liberals are talking about imposing a carbon tax, right, or cap and trade. So trying to tread the middle seems to have serious risks when it comes to the most politically motivated segments of the population. And my hunch is that the New Democrats will have probably learned their lesson from the last election. And if they can find a candidate that can appeal to large swaths of people and not risk appearing to be to the center or to the right of the Liberals, I think they have a chance of coming back. I think it was a mistake to get rid of Thomas Mulcair, personally. I thought he was a great leader of the opposition, most effective leader of the opposition in my lifetime and since television began, in the House of Commons. But no question that the last campaign was not a success for them. And if you were to ask people, what is the NDP about in this campaign? The answer is balanced budgets, right? They were ripe for the picking and the Liberals outsmarted them. I'd be surprised if they make that mistake again.
Why in Canada do we have that success where you don't find that center in the United States or in France or in Britain or Germany?
So my answer is it's the politics of nation building, that we've been so preoccupied in the country with, what is Quebec's place in Canadian nation? How do we align English and French? And really this politics of nation building has for a long time given us a different political dimension than existed in other countries, which for different reasons was a more traditional left-right divide. So people in the 80s looked at Canada, for example, and even if you looked at some of the data and you look back on Canadian history, there is no left-right divide between the parties. The parties were just trying to one-up each other. If the Liberals did something that was to the left, the Conservatives would just follow them and do the same thing, right? You could see that sort of oscillating and no real systematic left-right divide. But I think what we are seeing post-Charlottetown referendum, post the era of mega-constitutional politics in the 90s, is the end of a politics of nation building in Canada. I don't think we're preoccupied, at least we haven't been for the last 10 or 15 years, with questions about Quebec's place in the country. I don't think those are the kinds of questions dominating politics in Quebec. I don't think they're the kinds of questions dominating politics outside of the country. My hunch is we'll probably never see those questions come to dominate again. That's sort of maybe a dangerous prediction, but I just don't think there's enough motivation in the country for people to feel about it the same way that they did in the '95 referendum, for example. So I suspect we will settle into a more stable pattern of left-right politics that characterizes countries elsewhere. And it'll be up for the Liberals to see if they can chart a unique course as a centrist party, or if they're going to have to find a message that resonates to people as other parties in other countries have had to do over time.
Any other questions or comments?
I just wondered if you might comment on the misinformation which Trump has used in order to get elected, and also the sheer nastiness and base things that we heard down in the States while he was running to get into the position that he did. I just shake my head when I think of the same things happening in Canada, but are we headed that way after we hear people like Kevin O'Leary coming into the race and so on?
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly hope not, but I agree with you. And one point I would make as well, and I alluded to this as well, talking about Trump, that there's a traditional left-right divide, right, that is in the United States. So you have, in the 80s, you could think of what people felt about Ronald Reagan, right? Some people viscerally disliked him. And, you know, Reagan said things and did things that folks on the left wouldn't like. You know, people opposed Bush, and they opposed Bush Sr. and Bob Dole, right, and all these other sort of conservatives. But what Trump is doing is a very different category. It's got nothing to do with his policies. It's not to do with, you know, what you think of his largest tax break in history. It's got nothing to do with what you think of his, you know, positions on appointing pro-life judges to the Supreme Court or something like that. It's the other things that he's done. You know, and no one really has an answer because we've never seen this before in the data age. My hunch is that a lot of that stuff you won't be able to you can't undo it, right? You know, once it's out there, it's out there. So the violence at rallies, for example, the comments about the media, the applauding movements in other countries that are sort of anti-democratic, authoritarian, I think has changed the way American politics will be perceived and the impact American politics will have for a very long time, right? I just think it's once those horses are out of the barn, you're not getting them back. That's my sense. The fake news stuff, it's the challenge that we face there is overwhelming, right? It's not a matter of, we've talked a little bit about, like, can you inoculate students to fake news, or can you resist it yourself? Well, this stuff fools professors, it fools politicians. It's because it's carefully designed. Well, two things. First of all, there's a multi-billion-dollar, in some cases state-sponsored industry designed to actually present news in a particular way and to distribute that news to support, in the case of Russia, for example, to support the agenda of the Kremlin. I mean, RT, which is widely circulated, it's available on all your televisions. You see nicely packaged clips presenting a different perspective on the news. That's not like the CBC, right? This is a news organization designed to promote in large measure an agenda that Russia wants to see, or the Kremlin wants to see in the rest of the world. So as one person, it's very difficult to sort of resist that. Then you have all of these sort of private construction of completely false news, which, because it accords with people's pre-existing beliefs, people share uncritically, right? Because again, politics isn't rational, it's the intuition, right? Aha, I feel this is true, right? Sweden has fallen to Sharia law. I feel that to be true, so I'm going to share this, right? I'm going to agree to this and send it out. Or Toronto has fallen to Sharia law, which are things that I've heard and seen people truly, honestly believe on the internet, as fact, and they share it. And it circulates, and really with social media, what can we do about it, right? The old argument we would have had in Canada is let's look at it on the sort of the demand side. What we're going to do is we'll regulate the media, we'll regulate telecommunications policies, we'll have all sorts of things in place that will prevent this kind of information getting to Canadians. That doesn't work anymore. So now we have to focus, as best as I can tell, entirely on the demand side by, as best as we possibly can, teaching people to be critical consumers of news, and not just critical consumers of news on one side of the ideological agenda, but critical consumers of news, period. Because as soon as you start to imbue your suggestions with substantive content, you sort of trigger these ideological reactions that we see, these intuitive reactions. So if you want to show pro-Trump fake news, there'll be a bunch of Trump supporters in the audience who'll say, oh yeah, fake news, right? Or if you want to show pro-Democrat fake news, there will be a lot of people who'll say, oh yeah, you know, this is just the sort of right agenda, right? I think what we have to do, and maybe as a university professor this is a typical thing to say, but I think what we have to do is to teach people really the architecture, the structure of what a properly reasoned argument looks like, of what evidence looks like, and it's no longer the case that you just have to teach this to a small share of the population. Everybody has to be equipped with this now. If you're going to be on Twitter, you're going to be on Facebook, unless you are equipped with this, you're going to be fooled. And even if you are equipped with this, you're still going to be fooled, just hopefully less often, right? So I don't have the answer to that. That's my thoughts on it. Certainly I've been thinking about it quite a bit. I've never seen anything like we saw in the last election. I've never seen anything actually like this in American politics, and I'm not optimistic actually about the near term anyway for the American political environment. I'm much more optimistic about Canada actually. So, yeah.
Other questions or comments? Okay. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much, if I can say, Chris,
Yes,
for a
definitely,
fantastic
definitely.
talk and discussion. I thank you for your engagement. And I would like to end with a bout of clapping just to say thank you, and then I'll move on to really. And thank you all. At this point, I would also like to encourage you to think about coming back in the fall when our series resumes. This is really a wonderful opportunity for us to engage with you as members of the community. And another opportunity is coming up. I want to point out, if you don't know already, that the North American Indigenous Games are going to be, some of the events will be held here at UTSC. That's coming up this summer. And on Monday, May 29th, in the meeting place from 1 to 4 p.m., we do have an event that will include Indigenous culture, an introduction to the Games, and an opportunity to learn more about what's going to happen this summer, and to volunteer if you wish to during those games. So please do join us and learn a bit about those games. And again, I'd like to thank Chris and thank you all for attending this seminar series.
Thanks a lot.